Welcome to a tale of absinthe-fueled chaos, where Victorian England clutched its pearls with one hand and a forbidden cocktail with the other. The Green Fairy wasn't just a drink. She was a scandal in a bottle, dressed in herbal perfume and poor decisions. Behind every respectable curtain, someone was seeing things they very much couldn't explain at dinner. And it all started with one sugar cube. Too many. If you enjoy drifting off to stories where vice wore velvet and denial came in crystal glasses, hit that like button and subscribe for more delightfully subversive bedtime tales. This episode is part of our Victorian series, a cosy collection of bedtime stories exploring the most bizarre, baffling, and quietly rebellious lives of the 19th century. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's something oddly soothing about drifting off to tales steeped in ritual, respectability, and just the right amount of herbal misconduct. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and slip into a world where temperance was preached, and absinthe was still very much on the menu. You've just taken your first proper sip when the back door slams open and the constables pour in, boots loud on the warped floorboards, expressions primed for disappointment. Your instinct is to stand, but your knees vote otherwise. Someone knocks over a table, someone else knocks over a person. The man across from you grabs his coat, which is absolutely not his, and makes for the fire escape like a man halfway through a bad idea. The woman beside you doesn't flinch. She stirs her drink with a silver absinthe spoon, and calmly asks, "Is it Thursday already?" Apparently it is. The place is cramped, windowless, and smells like licorice, lamp oil, and damp wool. The sign outside still says, "And Price & Sons Pipes, Tobacco, Curiosities," but everyone in London knows the real show is in the room behind the curtain. If you're here, you either know someone, owe someone, or are someone no one respectable invites to dinner. The officer eyeing you has a moustache that suggests discipline, and a notebook that suggests trouble. You consider trying to look innocent, but the green ring around your lips isn't helping your case. And neither is the sugar cube that just fell from your lap to the floor with a gentle thud of guilt. He gestures for you to stand. You pretend not to notice. The man behind you coughs theatrically and says something about botanical medicine. No one laughs. As you're escorted out, politely but firmly, someone mumbles, "They never raid the gin palaces, do they?" It's not a question. It's a complaint. And it's true. In Victorian England, absinthe was never quite legal, nor quite illegal. It slipped into the country through dock workers' crates, travellers' luggage, and the occasional apothecary with questionable ethics and excellent handwriting. It was foreign. It was French. And that alone made it suspicious. The real issue wasn't what absinthe was. It was what it looked like. The drink was unnervingly green, opaque, slightly medicinal. It didn't froth or fizz like beer, nor gleam amber like whiskey. It swirled, it louched. And when mixed with sugar and cold water, it turned a cloudy, glowing white-green that looked like it should be kept in a locked cabinet under a cloth labelled for emergencies only. And then there were the ingredients. Real absinthe contained anise and fennel, which gave it that oddly sweet herbal slap in the face. But the scandalous component was wormwood. Artemisia absinthium, a plant known for its bitterness, its history in folk medicine, and its unfortunate ability to contain thujon. Victorians, never ones to miss a moral opportunity, seized on thujon as the likely culprit behind a wide variety of offences, including hallucinations, seizures, violent outbursts, fainting spells, and, in at least one case, a man proposing to an actress in public. None of it had been proven, of course. But that didn't stop temperance groups, religious reformers, or excitable editors from blaming the Green Fairy for the decline of everything from family values to military recruitment numbers. It didn't help that absinthe was being consumed in the same rooms as card games, revolutionary poetry, and women with unchaperoned opinions. In London, absinthe dens were never common, but they were noticed. The drink wasn't fashionable so much as it was forbidden, and that gave it exactly the kind of appeal that ensured people kept drinking it. Police raids, when they came, weren't about stopping drunkenness. They were about sending messages. This is not the continent. This is Britain. and we don't hallucinate before supper. But while the law was busy bursting through cellar doors and confiscating spoons, others took a quieter route. The drink itself was now under investigation, not by policemen with batons, but by doctors with beakers, scalpels, and a steady supply of unfortunate test subjects. If absinthe could corrupt the minds of artists and labourers, surely it would do the same to a mouse. And so, with medical charts in hand and tweezers at the ready, Victorian science prepared to meet the green fairy face to face, one seizure at a time. You're sitting in a room that smells like overcooked cabbage, formaldehyde, and professional concern. In front of you is a mouse named Reginald. Well, officially he's test subject 17, but no one's. Really sticking to that, he's currently swaying slightly and blinking at a wall as if it just insulted his mother. On the table beside him is a bottle of absinthe. Or rather, something that used to be absinthe before it was distilled, condensed, and made unfit for consumption by anything larger than a walnut. You're told it's all part of the experiment. You nod thoughtfully, like someone who understands chemistry and doesn't just want to go home. Dr. Forsyth is narrating again. Note the increased tremors, he says, as Reginald performs a movement somewhere between a shimmy and a seizure. A student takes notes. Another adjusts his tie and pretends this is all very routine. You're supposed to be observing for signs of hallucination, but it's difficult to say what qualifies when you're watching a rodent in a waistcoat-sized cage who's clearly having a rough afternoon. He licks the bars, he sneezes once, he stares at the ceiling for 6 full minutes. A few people applaud softly. Dr. Forsyth, visibly thrilled, declares it conclusive. Wormwood is toxic, dangerous, and possibly French. Reginald rolls onto his back with the dramatic flair of someone hoping to be remembered. You write in your notebook, subject appears morally compromised. While absinthe was quietly scandalising the back alleys of Soho, the real panic began, as so many do, in a laboratory. Dr. Valentin Magnan, a French psychiatrist and early adopter of alarmism, believed that absinthe wasn't just another drink. It was, in his professional opinion, a psychiatric event in a glass. And like any good Victorian doctor with a microscope and something to prove, he set out to create the kind of evidence that couldn't be ignored, namely, animals that convulsed on command. Magnan's methods were simple, if not entirely sound. He didn't test full-strength absinthe as people actually drank it. That would be far too realistic. Instead, he isolated pure wormwood oil and administered it directly to mice, guinea pigs, and other animals who had previously committed no crimes. The results were predictably unpleasant. Animals trembled, shrieked, bolted in circles, and occasionally expired with theatrical flair. It was precisely the kind of outcome he needed. Dramatic, measurable, and difficult to explain away as anything other than proof that absinthe was madness in liquid form. Of course, there were a few inconvenient details. The doses Magnan used were far stronger than what any human would willingly consume, and the animals hadn't been given alcohol at all. Just wormwood. Still, the headlines wrote themselves. Green madness proven, declared newspapers on both sides of the channel. British temperance advocates were delighted. Absinthe, long whispered about in dark rooms, could now be officially listed as scientifically terrifying. British journals began quoting Magnan without much fuss about context. His research became a sort of intellectual permission slip, a way to condemn absinthe without sounding like a busybody. Why argue about morality when you can cite seizures? And thus, a new medical vocabulary crept into the public consciousness. Terms like absinthism, epileptiform convulsions, and hallucinosis from botanical liquors entered the discussion, often printed in the same column as news about liver pills or criminal poetry. Doctors, barristers, and even magistrates began to whisper that absinthe could be used as a defence, that it might not just unhinge the mind, but erase the responsibility that came after. And all at once, the Green Fairy found herself somewhere even more dangerous than the cafe or the laboratory. She was now standing in the courtroom, where madness, crime, and intoxication had begun to overlap in increasingly convenient ways. You're in a courtroom trying very hard to look sane, which is tricky when your waistcoat is on backwards, and the magistrate keeps asking why you bit the pianist. There's a soft murmur from the gallery, the kind of noise people make when they're not sure whether to be horrified or impressed. You sit very still, dignified, or at least as dignified as someone can be while holding a handkerchief over a mysteriously bruised nose. The constable is testifying now. He's describing how you threw a sugar cube at a waiter and shouted, "Vive la République!" before somersaulting into a sideboard. You don't recall the somersault, or the sideboard, but the sugar cube sounds plausible. Your solicitor rises, calmly adjusting his cuffs like this is just another Tuesday. He clears his throat, nods toward the judge, and delivers the line you've been waiting for. "My client," he says, "had consumed a considerable quantity of absinthe." The room reacts exactly as hoped. One juror gasps, another tilts her head like she's suddenly reading a French novel. The judge squints at you as though your entire personality might be evidence. Your solicitor presses on, adding words like delirium, neurotoxicity, and continental liquor, each one wrapped in just enough mystery to sound medical. You glance around the room. If things go well, you may walk free. If they don't, you may be declared a ward of the Crown and banned from cutlery. Either way, you're not going home today. By the 1880s, the idea that absinthe could drive a man to madness had fully entered the Victorian legal system, not through logic, but through sheer narrative convenience. If you were caught in a brawl, threw a punch at a constable, or made a dramatic scene involving public nudity and a monocle, blaming absinthe offered just enough medical mystery to make the charges look flexible. The most famous example, though French in origin, rippled across English headlines like a shot through Punch. In 1905, a Swiss labourer named Jean Lanfray murdered his wife and 2 daughters after a long day of drinking, which critically had included 2 glasses of absinthe. Never mind that he'd also consumed wine, cognac, brandy, and a liqueur or 2. The public seized on one word: absinthe. His lawyers leaned into it. Absinthe, they argued, had unmoored his reason. He wasn't himself. He was a man overtaken. The newspapers christened it the Absinthe Murders, and within months new calls to ban the drink had crossed the channel. In England, the legal system wasn't far behind. While absinthe was less common than in France or Switzerland, its reputation had far outrun its distribution. Barristers began to cite it as a cause of temporary insanity or irresistible impulse, terms designed to sound both alarming and curable. Judges began to hear phrases like absinthe-induced delirium and mental rupture due to foreign liquor. Medical witnesses were brought in to explain thujone, wormwood, and the delicate workings of the artistic temperament. Some cases stuck, others didn't. But the strategy had taken root. Even those convicted would often receive sentences softened by the implication that it wasn't entirely their fault. The Green Fairy, once painted as a muse, had now become a convenient accomplice. Of course, not every absinthe incident involved murder. Some involved furniture, some involved trousers, some involved running down the street shouting about the Queen's eyebrows. But all of them shared a central idea. Absinthe made them do it. And soon, the courts weren't the only institutions taking notice. Because while judges debated intent and insanity, the cafes, especially the ones tucked behind shop fronts and music halls, were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Especially when things started breaking. Someone's been thrown through a folding chair and it's not even 8:30. Your glass is still half full, your nerves are halfway gone, and the man to your left just challenged the wallpaper to a duel. You shift your seat ever so slightly out of splash range. Across the room, a gentleman in shirt sleeves is making aggressive eye contact with a piano. The pianist has wisely excused himself. A waitress steps neatly over a fallen top hat and continues serving drinks as though nothing has happened. You begin to suspect she's seen worse. A man bursts through the back door, yells something about Belgium, and immediately gets tackled by a woman wielding an umbrella and a personal grudge. The umbrella wins. You try to act casual, which is difficult given the volume of shouting, and the chair legs someone just tossed in your general direction. You take another sip of your absinthe, and make a mental note to never attend poetry night again. A constable appears in the window, spots the situation, and slowly steps back into the fog, the Victorian equivalent of not my problem. Beside you, a woman in lace gloves delicately stirs her drink, watching the chaos unfold like it's a matinee performance. They always get rowdy when someone spills the sugar, she remarks. You nod, mostly because disagreeing with her seems statistically unsafe. Your table wobbles, the lights flicker. A portrait on the wall tilts dramatically, as if even Queen Victoria herself is unsure whether this is a public house or a mild revolution. You decide wisely not to stand. Although absinthe was often romanticised in poetry and paintings, its real-world reputation, particularly in Victorian England, was considerably less graceful. By the 1890s, the drink was increasingly associated with public disorder, especially among the working class. While upper-class men had their sherry and gentlemen's clubs, the Green Fairy had carved out her own niche, smoky music halls, back-alley taverns and tucked-away parlours where the drinks were cheap and the tempers cheaper. And despite absinthe's reputation for delicate hallucinations and artistic melancholy, most of its effects were simply due to its astonishing alcohol content. At 60% to 70% ABV, it didn't take much to turn a philosophical discussion into a brawl involving several chairs and, occasionally, a decorative bust of Queen Victoria. Reports from Soho, Camden Town and other districts tell the same story again and again. Shouting, broken glass, minor arson. Constables dispatched to investigate would often arrive late and leave quickly, having decided that intervening wasn't worth the bruises. One 1892 account from a Camden constable described an absinthe den as a crowded room filled with shouting men, shrieking women, and smoke so thick it could be cut into bricks and used for paving. The report concludes with the phrase, "No further action taken." The papers, of course, loved it. Headlines warned of green riots and wormwood madness. Political cartoons showed absinthe drinkers smashing furniture while hallucinating green devils, a detail that was at best speculative. But the violence wasn't just a punchline. For moral reformers, it became a campaign weapon. Every broken bottle was proof. Every police call was a statistic. And soon, absinthe wasn't just a drink associated with artists. It was a public menace, especially in the hands of those already viewed with suspicion, the poor, the foreign, the politically restless. Still, no one symbol shook Victorian sensibilities more than the sight of a woman with a glass of absinthe. Because if men were brawling and hallucinating, it was a crisis. But if women were doing it, well, that was something far more terrifying. You were promised tea and polite conversation. You got absinthe and a woman quoting Shelley with one stocking unbuttoned. To be clear, you're still in a drawing room. There's a piano, a chandelier, and a tray of untouched scones. But the hostess is sipping something distinctly herbal from a cut glass goblet, and the only topic of discussion is whether ghosts can read your aura. She invites you to sit, gestures vaguely at a doily, and offers you a drink. You consider refusing, but her smile suggests she knows something about you that you don't. You accept, mostly out of fear. The absinthe is pale green and entirely too confident. You stir it with the sugar spoon she provides, the same one, you note, that was likely meant for jam. Across the room, a vicar's wife is already 2 glasses in and trying to communicate with her late husband's terrier. Someone compliments the hostess's shawl. She thanks them and announces she no longer believes in ironing. The man beside you, who once wrote a stern letter to the Times, now appears to be sketching her ankles. You try to think of something sensible to say, something grounding, appropriate, Anglican, but all that comes out is, "Lovely doilies." She raises her glass. "To liberation," she says. You raise yours. "To embroidery." The room smells like lavender, licorice and light rebellion. If Victorian men drinking absinthe was considered troubling, women doing the same was nothing short of catastrophic, at least in the eyes of social commentators. The Victorian woman, idealised as the moral compass of the household, was supposed to sip tea, embroider cushions and suffer silently. She was not supposed to drink a potent foreign liquor that was already blamed for inciting violence, hallucinations and occasional nudity. And yet, by the 1890s, women were not only drinking absinthe, they were doing it in public, in cafes, in clubs, in the drawing rooms of artistic circles and spiritualist societies. Some even, and this was truly unforgivable, enjoyed it. Moralists panicked. Newspapers warned of the feminine decay of the empire. Political cartoons depicted women in corsets slumped beside empty bottles, gazing blankly at nothing while their children ran wild and their husbands wept softly into top hats. Temperance activists described female absinthe drinkers as fallen from virtue and lace, their descent blamed not on hardship but on improper reading habits and the influence of foreign fashions. One widely circulated pamphlet from 1893 warned that absinthe robbed a woman not only of her wits, but of her waistline, complexion, and Christian duty. It was not science, but it sold well. Even Queen Victoria was rumoured, falsely, to have banned absinthe from court gatherings, which only made it more fashionable in artistic circles. Where prohibition loomed, glamour followed. Some women claimed the drink sharpened their minds, others simply liked the ritual, the cold water, the sugar cube, the pale transformation in the glass. In the quiet rebellion of a well-dressed woman drinking something forbidden, there was power. But in the eyes of the public, that power came at a cost. Because a man made reckless by absinthe was a nuisance, a woman made fearless by it, that was a crisis. And for those already inclined towards strange ideas, mediums, mystics, poets, absinthe offered something more than escape. It offered visions. You came for a séance, you stayed because the hostess offered absinthe, and the parlour smelled less like ghosts and more like cinnamon biscuits. The table is round, the curtains are drawn, and someone has just asked if spirits can tell the future, specifically whether she should marry her cousin. No one answers, though the taxidermied owl above the fireplace appears to be judging her. The medium has gone into a trance, or indigestion, it's hard to say. Her eyes roll back, her hands flutter. She mutters something about an aggrieved naval officer, and then pauses to demand more sugar. You're handed a glass, cloudy green and suspiciously strong, and told to sip slowly. You don't. You sip exactly once and forget how elbows work. The wallpaper seems to sway. The shadows move in ways shadows typically don't. You're fairly certain the piano just sighed. The man beside you begins weeping and insists he's just seen his childhood dog wearing a monocle. You believe him. The dog looked trustworthy. Across the table, someone gasps, "She's here!" and points to an empty corner. Everyone nods solemnly. You look. You see a coat rack. You nod solemnly too. Better safe than spiritually insensitive. The idea of hallucinations caused by absinthe was one of the drink's most enduring legends, and one of its least scientifically supported. But that didn't stop Victorians from absolutely believing in it. By the late 1800s, spiritualism was thriving in Britain. Séances, table rapping, automatic writing, all the tools of the socially acceptable séance circuit, were increasingly popular among middle-class women, amateur mystics and the deeply bored. And absinthe fit right in. It wasn't officially part of the ritual, of course. But when served discreetly in a green-tinted cordial glass and paired with flickering gaslight and emotionally fragile company, absinthe quickly became the unofficial drink of the dead adjacent. The hallucinations it supposedly caused were perfect for the era. Mysterious, unprovable, and vaguely French. Writers and painters claimed to see visions, ghosts, strange creatures. The famed Green Fairy herself, a luminous, delicate woman said to appear at the edge of one's vision after the third glass. Usually beautiful, always suspicious. In reality, most of these visions were likely the result of overproof alcohol, poor nutrition, sleep deprivation, or occasionally a contaminated batch containing copper sulfate or toxic dyes. Still, the myth endured, and it wasn't just artists and mystics spreading it. Even newspapers ran wild with claims. In 1894, the Pall Mall Gazette published a report of a man in Bethnal Green who swore absinthe allowed him to glimpse a great green angel who whispered poetry and smelled of cigars. The angel may have been his landlord. The poetry was not published. Doctors weighed in cautiously. Some warned that excessive absinthe use could lead to delirious episodes, phantom sounds, or hallucinatory visions of insects and flames. Others politely suggested that anyone drinking 6 glasses of 136 proof alcohol might simply be unwell. Still, the public preferred the more dramatic explanation. Absinthe wasn't just strong, it was enchanted. It wasn't just intoxicating, it was otherworldly. And for those already teetering on the edge of propriety, it became a reason to fall with flair. But behind the visions, the glamour, and the theatrical fainting spells was a far more prosaic truth. Because for those who drank it every day, not for poetry or ghosts or rebellion, the consequences were far less romantic. It's either Tuesday morning or Friday afternoon, but you've stopped caring ever since your clock started hissing at you. You wake up fully clothed, face down in a stack of unpaid bills and what may or may not be a sandwich. The room is spinning, but it's doing so politely, as though trying not to disturb you. There's a glass on the floor, there's a bottle on the table, there's a second bottle on the windowsill which you don't remember placing there and now deeply distrust. You sit up slowly, the way one might approach a skittish horse or a tax audit. Your hands are shaking, your teeth are arguing. You mutter something that sounds like poetry but may actually be your gas bill. Across the room, the fireplace blinks. You decide not to engage. You tell yourself you'll stop tomorrow, or the day after, or as soon as your vision narrows to one functional eye and your fingers remember how spoons work. For now, you reach for the bottle, because it's the only thing in the room that isn't judging you, except the cat. But she's always been like that. For all the mystique and marketing, Absinthe's darker side was not particularly poetic. It wasn't all haunted painters and whispering spirits. For many habitual users, it was simply a long, slow collapse of body and mind. And by the 1890s, Victorian physicians had given it a name: absinthism. Unlike standard alcohol addiction, absinthism was said to have its own particular signature, one defined by violent tremors, hallucinations, seizures, and a gradual disintegration of reason. Doctors wrote about it in increasingly alarmed tones. One described patients as haunted men with shivering limbs and glassy stares. Another noted the softening of the brain, as though it were a dessert recipe. These were not isolated drinkers. They were daily dependent users, mostly men, often poor, sometimes formerly respectable, reduced to stammering shells. Unlike wine or gin, which had long-standing reputations in British drinking culture, absinthe was still foreign, and therefore easier to blame. Its herbal content, especially wormwood, gave medical professionals something to point at beyond just alcohol. Thujone, the chemical compound present in wormwood, became shorthand for madness, violence, and sudden moral collapse. Withdrawal was described as especially brutal, shaking, nightmares, cravings. One man in Whitechapel was reported to have chewed his own sleeve in a fit of hunger for the green spirit. It was unclear whether that was literal or metaphorical, but the press didn't mind either way. Cases cropped up in asylums, as mostly anecdotal, often overstated. But to the public, absinthism became the new bogeyman. It wasn't just drunkenness, it was a diagnosis, a fate. And yet, the allure remained. Even as the symptoms became harder to ignore, some clung to the myth. They saw in absinthe a kind of artistic nobility, a beautiful madness that came with side effects. The pale green glass was still romanticised, still whispered about, still poured, especially in the cafes and garrets of the troubled and the talented, because among the drink's most famous casualties were not unknown men in alleyways, but the artists who helped create its legend. You're broke, hungover, and emotionally married to your paintbrush. The landlady is knocking again. You pretend you're dead. She doesn't buy it. She's met artists before. There's a single boot in the middle of the floor that you've been sketching for 3 days. You've named it something French and tragic. You've written a poem about its laces. It's your muse now. Your last meal was half a biscuit and a sip of turpentine, and yet you feel inspired or dizzy, possibly both. You reach for your glass of absinthe and nod solemnly at the canvas, as if you and it are locked in a slow-moving duel of mutual disappointment. Outside, someone is shouting about revolution. Inside, your only rebellion is painting a pair so emotionally devastating it might cause someone to faint. The room spins slightly. The gas lamp flickers. You wonder if that's your own hand shaking or just the floor expressing an opinion. You drink, you paint, you suffer, which is to say, you are, in every meaningful Victorian sense, an artist. In the late 19th century, absinthe and artistry became inseparable clichés, thanks in large part to the very real drinking habits of very famous men who didn't always know when to stop. Most notorious was Vincent van Gogh, whose relationship with absinthe was as complicated as his relationship with, well, everything. He drank it, painted it, wrote about it, and quite possibly blamed it for a few of his less advisable decisions, including the infamous ear incident, which may or may not have followed a night of green fairy companionship. Van Gogh's doctors noted his hallucinations, his violent mood swings, and his tendency to ingest turpentine when wine wasn't available. Whether absinthe made him mad or simply found him that way is still debated, but by the time he died in 1890, he'd become the poster child for the tortured absinthe-soaked genius. Enter Edgar Degas, who painted absinthe not as a muse, but as a menace. His 1876 work L'Absinthe, which depicts a woman slumped over a glass, looking like she just received terrible news and can't remember what it was, became one of the most damning visual indictments of the drink. The British press called it a warning to our daughters, and French critics dubbed it the portrait of moral collapse. Other artists followed suit: Toulouse-Lautrec, Manet, Picasso, each one dabbling in green fairy aesthetics, whether they drank it or not. Absinthe was now more than a drink. It was a symbol of freedom, madness, creativity, and conveniently your excuse for not finishing commissions on time. The myth spread fast. Want to be a genius? Drink absinthe. Want to be misunderstood? Swirl it theatrically and mutter about brushstrokes. Want to suffer for your craft? Nothing says, I am serious, like hallucinating lizards while painting your landlord's niece. But beneath the glamour, real lives unravelled. Genius rarely paid the bills, and while absinthe may have lit the candle, many of these men were already burning at both ends. Still, the legend stuck. Even as the drink's reputation darkened, even as public patience wore thin. Because while artists could be forgiven for their madness, society was beginning to tire of everyone else's. You're attending a public lecture titled The Dangers of the Green Fairy, a threat to hearth and empire. You are promised light refreshments. There are none. You're seated between a man who smells like boiled cabbage and a woman who clutches her umbrella like she plans to use it as a weapon. The room is warm. The opinions are warmer. On stage stands a physician with wild hair, a pocket watch on a dramatic chain, and the kind of moustache that suggests he's diagnosed more wallpaper than patients. He is mid-sentence. And then, gentlemen, the absinthe attacked the spinal column directly, as the audience gasps like they've just been told the Queen has taken up fencing. You attempt to look serious and alarmed, but your tea has gone cold, and someone behind you keeps muttering continental degeneracy every 7 seconds. The doctor holds up a medical diagram of a brain labelled before and after. The after is mostly scribbles and flames. You're unsure if it's meant to represent damage or demonic possession, but the knitting lady beside you clucks disapprovingly and whispers, "My nephew started sketching moths after just 1 sip." Next comes a pamphlet, The Green Terror, complete with an illustration of a woman collapsing into moral ruin, while a horned absinthe bottle laughs behind her. You flip through it. One page claims the drink can cause visions of serpents, unnatural dancing, and in extreme cases a fondness for French poetry. A vicar rises from the front row and delivers an impromptu prayer to shield the nation's youth from herbal wickedness. He is applauded. You're beginning to suspect the only person in this room who's actually tried absinthe is still hallucinating in the cloakroom. As the speaker concludes with the phrase, "national decline via imported liquor," the audience rises in unison, slightly sweaty and thoroughly horrified. The knitting woman turns to you and mutters, "Next week they're doing laudanum." I hear there's a diagram. You nod and vow never again to attend a lecture that doesn't come with biscuits. As absinthe's popularity grew in the late 19th century, so too did the volume of its detractors, and they were organised, articulate, and deeply invested in being horrified. Temperance groups, religious societies, women's leagues, and public health reformers all found common cause in their hatred of the green fairy. And unlike gin, long dismissed as the poor man's poison, absinthe had an aura of sophistication, foreignness, and bohemian mischief that made it feel newly dangerous. Worse, it seemed to appeal to people who should have known better. Artists, intellectuals, fashionable women, and young men who didn't want to enlist. The press joined in with great enthusiasm. Cartoons in Punch and the Illustrated Police News showed slack-jawed absinthe drinkers hallucinating devils, skeletons, and disgraced relatives. Doctors published case studies with titles like Observations on Wormwood Madness and Absinthe, a botanical menace, full of symptoms that were vague enough to terrify anyone with a hangover. Moral panic, once sparked, was hard to extinguish. In Switzerland, the Lanfray murders had already prompted national outrage. France began debating restrictions. Belgium weighed import bans. And although Britain never embraced absinthe with the same fervour, its downfall was being plotted from church basements and public health offices alike. One 1898 lecture in London warned that absinthe consumption could lead to abandonment of domestic virtue, decay of industrious habits, and partial possession by the devil. The speaker received a standing ovation. It wasn't just drinkers who came under suspicion. Anyone associated with absinthe, importers, vendors, chemists, artists, risked becoming a cautionary tale. Even the ritual of preparation was mocked. The delicate sugar cube, the glass fountain, the slotted spoon, all seen as evidence of dangerous indulgence dressed up as culture. Behind the righteous fury was a real concern. Absinthe wasn't just another drink. Its strength, ritual, and reputation made it more than intoxicating. It was fashionable, and that made it harder to control. But laws were coming. Whispers of reform turned to drafts of policy. And though Britain wouldn't officially ban absinthe as France eventually would, the writing was on the tavern wall. The age of the green fairy was fading, at least in public. Because for every den that shuttered, another opened quietly in the back of a tobacconist's shop, where the absinthe still dripped, slow and steady, over a sugar cube melting like scandal. You're standing in a dark alley behind a tobacconist who also sells cough syrup, anarchist pamphlets, and, on Thursdays, enlightenment. You've memorised the password. You've worn your quietest shoes. You're trying not to look like a government informant, but your overcoat smells suspiciously of starch and middle-class guilt. You knock 3 times, pause, knock once more, then tap out something that resembles Morse code but mostly sounds like indigestion. The door creaks open. A man in a velvet waistcoat peers out and squints. "Password?" he asks, adjusting his monocle with the seriousness of a man about to commit mild treason. You whisper, "Wormwood?" He nods slowly. And the secret phrase? Your mind blanks, you panic, you blurt, "The bishop's ankles are unusually provocative this season." He stares at you, then steps aside. Close enough. You're led down a narrow hallway lined with faded portraits of people who look like they've all made poor life choices in expensive clothing. The room opens into a parlour filled with candlelight, hushed voices, and enough eccentricity to qualify as a medical condition. A man in pince-nez is playing the violin, badly. A woman in opera gloves is reciting something tragic in Portuguese. A painter is trying to capture the essence of betrayal using only shades of chartreuse. You nod at him. He sobs softly. A server in spats hands you a cloudy green drink and murmurs, "We don't say the A word here. We call it herbal concentrate." You nod solemnly, as if you too are deeply concerned about branding. You take a sip. It tastes like licorice, regret, and the sudden urge to write sonnets about your landlord's daughter. The green fairy, it seems, is still very much alive. She's just hiding behind the drapes, sipping dramatically and pretending she doesn't miss the applause. By the turn of the 20th century, absinthe was no longer a fashionable vice. It was a whispered one. In Britain, it was never formally banned, but growing pressure from public health officials, moral societies and newspapers made it increasingly difficult to import, sell, or even discuss, without being accused of poor judgment and probably communing with Satan. But as with all things forbidden, this only enhanced its appeal. Rather than disappear, absinthe simply went underground. In London, small clubs and artistic salons continued to serve it quietly. It was recast not as a dangerous drug, but as a symbol of elite rebellion, something for the disillusioned intellectual, the bored heiress, or the playwright who felt gin was too pedestrian. Some clubs disguised it as herbal medicine, others labelled it continental cordial and kept it in the back, behind the pickled onions and things no one ever asked about. Certain cafes near Fleet Street served it in coded teacups, green-tinted glassware hidden beneath lace doilies and plausible deniability. Importers became creative. Absinthe was shipped in bottles labelled eau de vie or decorative cleaning fluid, depending on the customs officer's level of suspicion. Recipes were altered. Wormwood levels were adjusted, but the ritual remained. The glass, the sugar cube, the slow drip of cold water, and the sense that one was participating in something ancient, illicit, and ever so slightly French. It became a drink of quiet defiance, even as continental bans rolled in, Switzerland in 1908, France in 1915. Britain's absinthe scene adapted rather than vanished. After all, no law had technically been passed, and the Green Fairy still had her admirers, eccentric aristocrats, poets with questionable facial hair, and painters who preferred their inspiration with a kick. Still, the drink was in decline. Fewer suppliers, quieter gatherings, and rising alternatives, opium, ether, and eventually cocaine, drew attention elsewhere. By the 1910s, absinthe had become less a threat and more a relic, a whispered indulgence, a ghost in a green bottle. But as history would prove, even ghosts can be resurrected. You're attending a funeral for a beverage. There's no coffin, but someone's placed an empty absinthe bottle on a lace doily and surrounded it with violets and questionable poetry. A man in the corner is playing a sorrowful tune on a concertina, and it's unclear whether he's mourning or just deeply unemployed. You sit in a creaky wooden chair beside a woman in mourning gloves who claims absinthe once made her faint during a watercolour class. She's been dining out on that story for 15 years. The gathering is small, a few artists, a failed playwright, 2 spiritualists, and someone who used to sell spoons. Everyone looks pale and vaguely poisoned. Instead of wine, you're handed a glass of tepid gin with a dash of wormwood bitters for symbolism. It tastes like regret. The hostess, dressed entirely in black taffeta and unnecessary drama, clears her throat and raises her glass. "To the Green Fairy," she says solemnly, "may she haunt the dreams of dull men forever." There's a murmur of agreement. Someone weeps into a handkerchief embroidered with skulls. Someone else tries to start a slow clap but gives up halfway through. You look around the room and realise this is how fads die. Not with scandal, not with riots, but with awkward toasts, weak gin, and one man whispering, "I still have half a bottle if anyone's interested." By the early 20th century, absinthe's grip on Victorian Britain had all but vanished. Though it was never outright banned in the UK as it was in France or Switzerland, social pressure, legal red tape, and persistent fear-mongering pushed it out of bars, homes, and polite conversation. The same drink that had once inspired poets and painters now existed primarily as a warning, a tragic footnote in medical journals and temperance sermons. In 1915, France officially banned absinthe, blaming it for moral decay, mental illness, and the occasional family annihilation. Switzerland had already done so. Belgium followed. The British government, always slightly more passive-aggressive, simply allowed import restrictions, customs seizures, and endless bad publicity to do the work. The Green Fairy had become a ghost. The once grand ritual, the fountains, the spoons, the delicate drip over sugar, gave way to more respectable drinks, port, sherry, and the dependable British gin. Absinthe drinkers were recast not as tortured romantics, but as cautionary tales. Fainting women, shouting men, hallucinating dock workers who mistook their boots for serpents. By the 1920s, absinthe was practically extinct in Britain. What remained were whispers. An old glass tucked away in an antique shop, a faded painting of a woman slumped at a cafe table, a rumour that someone in Bloomsbury still had a bottle, unopened, unloved, and almost certainly illegal. And yet, like all good Victorian scandals, absinthe was never truly gone. It lingered in stories, in article, in the back pages of forgotten books. It became mythic, a symbol of beauty, rebellion, and very poor decisions made in velvet coats. and decades later, quietly, it would rise again. Not as a threat, not as a panic, but as a curiosity, and for some, a homecoming. You find it in a dusty corner of an antique shop wedged between a corset-tightening device and something labelled Victorian tooth key, lightly used. The bottle is emerald green, faintly glowing with the energy of something that has no business still existing. The shopkeeper squints at it like he's not sure if it's for sale or haunted. He leans over the counter. Imported. Pre-ban. Probably legal. You don't ask follow-up questions. At home, you place it gently on your kitchen table, like it's a sleeping cat with a criminal record. You stare at it for an hour. You Google things like how to summon absinthe spirit without spiritual side effects and is mild hallucination chic. You buy the spoon, the glass, the sugar cube. You briefly consider wearing a velvet smoking jacket but decide against it because you don't own one, and you'd look suspiciously like your Uncle Gerald who once tried to start a tarot business in Portsmouth. You prepare it exactly as the Victorians did, with ceremony, drama, and no actual understanding of what you're doing. The sugar melts, the drink clouds, the air smells like licorice and bold decisions. You take a sip, your eyes water, your sinuses reorganize, your soul lifts slightly out of your body to say, "Really?" You blink. The walls are still. The cat is not speaking French. Disappointing, but safe. And yet, you feel something. Not madness, not visions. Just a strange, elegant chaos. Like you've inherited someone else's terrible ideas. And they were fabulous. After nearly a century of prohibition, myth, and moral panic, absinthe crept back into the world. Not with a scandal, but with a shrug. By the early 2000s, bans were lifted across Europe and the United States, fueled by better science, persistent curiosity, and a global population that had grown bored with vodka. New research revealed that the long-feared chemical in wormwood, thujone, had been wildly exaggerated. The levels in traditional absinthe weren't nearly enough to cause hallucinations, madness, or impromptu fencing matches with furniture. Most of the drink's worst effects had come from high alcohol content, contaminated batches, and Victorian enthusiasm. With the myths debunked, absinthe returned as a novelty, served in dimly lit bars with a wink and a sugar cube. Modern distilleries recreated 19th century recipes. Bartenders relearned the drip. Artists raised a nostalgic eyebrow. In England, it was never rebanned, just quietly re-embraced. Today, you can find absinthe in artisan shops, hip cocktail lounges, and the occasional eccentric uncle's liquor cabinet. It's no longer feared, just misunderstood, like an ex-poet who got a job in IT but still wears scarves indoors. And yet, despite the science, despite the logic, despite the carefully printed label that says drink responsibly, the myth lives on. Because part of you still half expects the green fairy to show up, not to tempt you into madness, but maybe to say, you're not imagining it, life is stranger than it looks, and sometimes a little drama in a glass is exactly what you need. You've brought flowers, a polite smile, and the creeping suspicion that your friend no longer recognizes furniture as furniture. The asylum is nicer than you expected. High ceilings, long corridors, and that faint institutional smell of boiled parsnips and denial. You're guided past a man shouting at his own shadow, and another composing a symphony entirely in coughs. A nurse greets you with the exhausted eyes of someone who's seen 3 attempted exorcisms, and a man marry a curtain this week. They lead you to the visitor's room, a cheerless little space furnished entirely in furniture that's been politely nailed down. You sit in a padded chair that squeaks in protest like it remembers better times. Your friend enters with the energy of someone who's just argued with a window and lost. His hair is a manifesto. His eyes flicker with the unmistakable gleam of someone who's been places, none of them good. Most of them absinthe-flavoured. He grins. "She's still with me, you know." The green fairy. You nod cautiously. She's been hiding in the wallpaper. Doesn't like the tea. You offer the violets you brought. He accepts them solemnly, then eats one. The nurse frowns but doesn't intervene. Probably not the strangest thing she's seen today. He leans in and whispers, They say it was the drink, but I know the truth. It was the upholstery, too smug by half. The nurse checks her watch and clears her throat. You stand to leave. He waves regally, then begins lecturing the corner plant about the politics of sugar cubes. As you walk back down the corridor, you pass a man reciting Shakespeare to a coat rack. He's doing quite well. You wonder briefly if you should have brought him absinthe, or if that's what got him here in the first place. By the 1880s, Victorian Britain was flooded with concerns about madness, particularly the fashionable, artistic absinthe drinking kind. The connection between absinthe and mental illness became a common feature in both medical journals and popular imagination. Where once madness had been the purview of the truly unfortunate or tragically inbred, now it had a new accomplice, the Green Fairy. Physicians blamed absinthe for a range of mental afflictions, everything from nervous agitation to full-blown hallucinations, seizures, and morally unanchored behaviour. One 1887 asylum report in London described an unmarried gentleman, 34, who mistook gas lamps for angels and refused all food except sugar cubes and aniseed. While alcohol-related insanity was nothing new, absinthe's reputation added an artistic, foreign twist. It wasn't just drunkenness, it was exotic psychosis, a madness that wore perfume and spoke French. Asylums across Britain recorded cases of absinthe drinkers admitted for hallucinations, trembling, obsessive drawing, and even disorders of a poetic nature. One doctor from Bristol famously wrote that a patient believed himself to be haunted by a small green woman with opinions on wallpaper. He was sedated and later assigned to janitorial work, which apparently helped. And yet, most doctors admitted in private that the drink itself was only partly to blame. Extreme alcohol consumption, poor nutrition, and the occasional adulterated batch of absinthe containing copper sulfate or lead-based dyes played a much larger role. But the newspapers didn't care about dosage. They wanted devils in the walls. They wanted mad poets in straitjackets. They wanted public horror with a teaspoon of sugar, and the public, as ever, was happy to oblige. Absinthe may have slipped from cafe tables and into padded cells, but it was still very much on the mind. And outside the asylum walls, a new class of opportunists began circling. People with cure-alls, nerve tonics, and solutions that involved just a bit more drinking. You're seated in the second row of a dimly lit lecture hall beside a man who brought his own chair and insists it's for alignment purposes. On stage stands a man in a velvet waistcoat, a waxed moustache, and the unmistakable confidence of someone who printed his own medical license. "Ladies and gentlemen," he booms, "I am Dr. Elbridge Tranquility, hypnotist, botanist, and licensed extractor of spiritual tension." He gestures dramatically to a chalkboard behind him that says only, "The Brain, Parts Unknown." You are handed a pamphlet titled, "Why Wormwood is Your Real Father." The subtitle reads, "Also available as a tonic." To demonstrate his methods, Dr. Tranquility pulls a clearly reluctant man from the audience, seats him in a chair, and begins swinging a pocket watch while chanting, "You are calm. You are brave. You no longer fear your mother-in-law." Then, for reasons unclear, he pours a generous splash of absinthe down the man's throat and yells, "Activate!" The man blinks once, mutters something about a haunted hat, and begins clapping slowly, as though trying to remember how hands work. The audience erupts in applause. You erupt in concern. Dr. Tranquility paces the stage, listing benefits, cures melancholia, improves moral posture, may temporarily allow you to speak with household pets. He then unveils his signature product, a glowing green bottle labelled Soothing Essence of Fennel Confidence, with bonus vibrations. You're encouraged to buy now before your spleen starts doubting itself. Behind you, a woman faints. It's unclear whether from the pitch, the absinthe, or sheer spiritual congestion. You exit with a bottle, a business card that says "Doctor" in quotation marks, and the sense that your health may have just been spiritually realigned, sideways. In Victorian Britain, where medicine often involved leeches, laudanum, or good old-fashioned denial, it was no surprise that absinthe found its way into every corner of the health-crazed circus. It was sold as a digestive aid, a nerve stabiliser, a cure for melancholia, and, somewhat ambitiously, an aphrodisiac. Advertisements claimed it could prevent epilepsy, strengthen the heart, and help the overburdened lady of society return to her morning duties with clarity and sparkle. Many of these tonics were 80-proof alcohol laced with wormwood and bravado, usually sold by men in oversized hats with diplomas from the Institute of Self-Actualization and other inventions. Absinthe also slipped into the world of mesmerism, a popular and largely fictional branch of hypnosis that suggested ailments could be cured by rearranging someone's magnetic aura, ideally after a glass of something green and mildly flammable. Lectures were held, demonstrations performed, and in one London hall, a mesmerist was arrested for selling absinthe-laced healing tea to a group of widows who claimed they saw angels, ex-husbands, and a particularly judgmental spaniel. These pseudoscientific peddlers thrived in the grey space between medicine and entertainment, promising health while delivering hangovers, visions, and the occasional accidental enlightenment. While mainstream physicians increasingly warned of absinthe's dangers, the quacks just updated the label. Not a danger, a spiritual side effect. By the 1890s, authorities began cracking down on unauthorised medical claims, and many of these gentlemen disappeared, along with their tonics, remedies, and unlicensed therapy crocodiles. But not before they'd left a legacy of Victorian absurdity, economic fraud, and truly excellent packaging. And thanks to the press, those absurdities would soon become front-page hysteria. You're a junior reporter at a respectable London newspaper, which is to say your job is to make the empire seem composed and the middle class seem terrified. Today's assignment: cover a minor incident involving a gentleman who had, after 3 suspiciously herbal drinks, attempted to engage in a heated debate with a gas lamp. You write it up quietly, sensibly, until your editor appears behind you like a ghost smelling faintly of ink and judgment. Needs more doom, he says. Make it moral decay. Make it Parisian. Make it about women if you can. You revise accordingly. Suddenly it's not one man with poor balance, it's a nation under siege. Absinthe isn't a drink, it's a continental threat. You insert phrases like foreign vice, artistic delusions, and collapse of decency, and the editor beams as if you've just cured gout. At the next desk, a colleague is crafting a front-page piece titled The Green Curse, a widow's tale, involving a fainting incident at a luncheon and one hallucinated goose. No one questions it. The illustrations come in, dramatic, frantic, not entirely proportional. One features a skeletal woman cradling an empty bottle, while bats fly out of her bonnet. The editor approves it without blinking. By noon, the presses are rolling. By evening, society is convinced absinthe has personally unbuttoned Britain's moral corset. You hang up your coat, collect your shilling, and head home, wondering not for the first time whether the public would panic quite so efficiently without your help. While moral crusaders shouted in lecture halls and doctors scribbled frantically in journals, the Victorian press did what it did best: weaponized scandal. Absinthe was a gift, a foreign drink, consumed ritually, associated with madness, art, women, crime, and the French. You couldn't not publish it. Papers like the Pall Mall Gazette, the Illustrated Police News, and the Graphic ran sensational stories of absinthe-induced murders, breakdowns, and bohemian depravity. Headlines screamed about green madness, continental corruption, and ladies of leisure lost to the lure of liquor. One infamous article described a man who believed himself to be a serpent after a single glass. Another warned that absinthe drinkers were prone to artistic urges, foreign accents, and short temper with clerks. Illustrations were even worse: skeletal drunkards, demonic hallucinations, women fainting into absinthe fountains. It was Victorian clickbait, and it sold out by the morning. Some of the stories were true, at least partially. Absinthe had caused hospitalizations. Hallucinations did occur, especially when mixed with poor nutrition, heavy drinking, or adulterated batches. But reality was never quite enough. The press embellished, exaggerated, and immortalized the Green Fairy as a seductive force of destruction. Absinthe became a symbol of everything Britain feared: foreign influence, uncontrolled emotion, unladylike behaviour, men with velvet hats and unstable sideburns. Even as actual consumption declined, public paranoia skyrocketed. Politicians quoted headlines in Parliament. Housewives clipped articles for their scrapbooks of things that caused scandal. Clergymen read them aloud, dramatically, as cautionary tales. And while absinthe never got the formal ban it received in France or Switzerland, it was socially dismantled by the press, stripped of glamour, dignity, and plausible deniability. The bottle hadn't been emptied, but no one respectable wanted to be seen holding it. And so began the next phase. Fakes, frauds, and moral alternatives, all pretending to fill the void. You order absinthe. The waiter smiles the way a man does when delivering bad news politely. We no longer serve that, he says, as if it's a health violation. But we do offer a moral substitute. You blink. He returns moments later with something pale, vaguely green and trembling in its glass. You sip. It tastes like celery water filtered through a hymn book. You ask what's in it. He beams and replies, barley infusion with wild thyme. Lightly sanctified. You consider running. Across the room, a man in a clerical collar is praising his drink's upright flavour profile. A woman beside him nods while chewing what appears to be an entire sprig of fennel. You try again, this time asking for something with a bit more character. You are served a lukewarm cordial named Temperance Dew. It tastes like boiled anise and shame. The label says it supports intestinal clarity and discourages romantic impulsivity. It succeeds. Your friend orders a new drink called chartreuslet, which smells like disappointment and stale wallpaper. You both stare into your glasses as if something might improve, but nothing does, because nothing can. The green fairy is gone, replaced by virtue in a bottle and the nagging taste of social approval. With absinthe exiled from polite society, the Victorian market did what it always did when scandal met demand. It got creative and made fakes. A flurry of morally appropriate alternatives flooded shops, chemists and cafes. These range from mild herbal cordials to bold frauds in green bottles. The packaging often mimicked real absinthe, but the contents were disappointingly free of wormwood, complexity and character. Products like household elixir, botanical fortifier and temperance fennel draught promised to deliver the flavour, or at least the idea, of absinthe, without the risks of moral decay or newspaper headlines. Meanwhile, some producers simply slapped new labels on old bottles and hoped the authorities didn't read French. In more desperate cases, some sellers resorted to outright deception, offering absinthe substitutes made with low-grade alcohol, food colouring, and dangerous additives like copper salts to recreate the green hue. These were often more toxic than the real thing. Even as public figures denounced absinthe, many quietly indulged in these half-hearted replacements, pretending that if it didn't have a scandalous name, it didn't count. By the early 1900s, the absinthe ritual had been reduced to a parody. The fountains disappeared, the spoons gathered dust, and the drink itself was either diluted beyond recognition or swapped out entirely for tonics that claimed to invigorate the liver and discourage idle thought. And yet, even among the barley blends and moral bitters, the memory of the green fairy lingered, not just as a scandal, but as a symbol of rebellion, art, and flavour. Which is why, decades later, when the fog lifted and the rules relaxed, absinthe didn't need to reinvent itself. It only had to reappear, and now, as the final sugar cube dissolves and the parlour dims under the green glow of whispered addictions, stolen rituals, and one particularly opinionated apothecary's cat, I hope, this mildly scandalous journey through Victorian absinthe leaves a pleasant tingle, like fennel on the tongue and trouble in the air. You've survived hallucinating dock workers, lace-draped cafe disasters, spiritualised wormwood, and more euphemisms for herbal tonic than any pharmacy register could justify. But for now, it's time to rest. The spoon is dry, the bottle's cork is back in place, and the vicar's niece has stopped seeing ghosts, at least out loud. If you're still awake, impressive. You've just endured the Empire's finest attempt at drinking rebellion into oblivion, and you didn't even spill on the antimacassar. Subscribe, and we'll uncork another secret from the fog tomorrow night. and as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, far from cautionary headlines and sugar-laced hysteria, and into sleep.